They called him the Iceman, a name whispered in fear, a legend carved into the cold heart of the New York underworld. Antonio Moretti. To his men, he was unbreakable. To his rivals, he was a ghost, a myth of a man who simply could not be hurt. But this wasn't strength forged by discipline. It was a curse born in a doctor's office. Antonio suffered from congenital insensitivity to pain, a rare condition that turned him into the perfect predator. No broken bone registered. No burn. No blade. Nothing could make him flinch, but his body's silence came at a horrific cost. His soul was left wide open. The emotional pain, the betrayal, the fear, he felt it all with a brutal, magnified intensity. The Iceman was the strongest man alive, yet the most emotionally vulnerable. Antonio wasn't born a capo. He was born a casualty of science. Picture a 7-year-old boy in a hospital, looking down at a severe injury that should have crippled him with agony. But there was nothing. No tears. No scream. Just a blank, almost bored stare. His father, a rising figure in the Colombo family, didn't see a fragile child. He saw an asset. He realized this lack of pain was a power, a shield against the world. He taught Antonio to harness it, to use his indifference to suffering as a tool of fear and control. His teenage years were a training ground. While other young men feared the initiation, the physical demands, the beatings, Antonio endured them all, simply waiting for them to finish. He mastered the poker face of the mob because he never had to fake his physical resilience. By 25, Antonio had earned his nickname and his stripes. His lack of hesitation in a fight, his total disregard for his own safety, made him terrifyingly effective. He moved up the ranks quickly, not through cunning, but through sheer, destructive capability. The stories are legendary. The time he walked through a barrage of bullets, only stopping because he was standing in a river of his own blood. The time he was cornered, and the only thing that saved him was the sight of him calmly setting his own broken shoulder back into place. But the higher he climbed, the colder the air became. His emotional world shrunk to nothing but isolation. He couldn't connect with the simple joy or fear of his peers. He saw their relationships, their fleeting happiness, and felt only a vast, echoing emptiness. The weapon had become lonely. The turf war with the Moretti family's biggest rivals was reaching a fever pitch. On a cold, industrial night, Antonio was ambushed. This wasn't a skirmish. It was an execution attempt. He fought like a machine, but the numbers were overwhelming. He was down, leaking life from a dozen unseen tears in his skin. He couldn't feel the damage, but he knew the signs of death. This was the night he nearly bled out, not from a clean hit, but from simple, unnoticed exhaustion. And then, in the middle of a chaotic scene of police and paramedics, he was found by Dr. Lena Petrova, a street-smart, no-nonsense medic, forced into his orbit by fate. She saw the most brutal physical trauma she'd ever encountered, yet the patient was utterly silent. Lena was furious. She demanded a reaction. She needed to know what hurt. Antonio simply watched her, fascinated. Here was someone attempting to understand and alleviate something he physically couldn't feel. It was a language he'd never learned. Their early exchanges were a battle of wills. She'd probe a wound. He'd stare blankly. She'd snap in frustration, and he'd smirk. But Lena didn't back down. She stopped asking, "Where does it hurt?" and started asking, "What are you thinking?" And in those small, quiet moments in the secured safe house, Antonio began to answer. He spoke of the weight of command, the loneliness of power, the intense, crushing grief of losing his mother years before, a pain that eclipsed every other sensation. Lena saw the flaw in the logic of the Iceman. She saw that the lack of physical pain made his emotional pain unmanageable, ungrounded. When he felt sad, it was despair. When he felt slighted, it was towering rage. His body couldn't signal danger, so his soul screamed instead. She started treating his mental and emotional wounds more than the physical ones. She didn't teach him to feel pain. She taught him to manage the feelings that pain was supposed to distract him from. She taught him humanity. Antonio found himself craving her presence. Not for medical care, but for the simple, soothing reality of her empathy. He was falling in love, but for a man who could burn the world to protect a financial ledger, this was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. The whisper started. Antonio was taking risks. He was distracted. He had a weakness, a constant presence that wasn't loyal to the family. His enemies, led by the calculating Capo Silvio Verone, began to investigate the medic. Verone saw it instantly. Antonio's money, territory, and influence were unassailable. But Lena was a clean, pure target. She wasn't mob. She was just a woman with a good heart. Antonio tried to warn her off, pushing her away using the only language he truly knew, cold indifference. But Lena, seeing the desperation beneath the Iceman's facade, refused to leave. She told him that she'd spent her life healing, and he was the most worthwhile patient she'd ever found. The attack was swift and brutal. Verone's men, knowing Antonio would never expect a target outside his usual sphere, took Lena from her apartment. They wanted to draw him out of his fortified world and into a place where they controlled the stakes. The phone call Antonio received was the worst agony of his life. Not the feeling of a broken bone, but the devastating, paralyzing fear of loss. A feeling that shook him to his core, overriding every instinct of self-preservation. Verone's demand was simple: trade your life for hers. Walk into the abandoned warehouse alone, or she dies. For the Iceman, this wasn't a choice. It was a destiny written the moment he allowed himself to love. Antonio walked in, unarmed, wearing his vulnerability like a banner. But he wasn't there to surrender. He was there to unleash the full, terrifying power of a man who suddenly had something to lose. The moment Verone's crew laid a hand on Lena, Antonio broke. Not physically, but emotionally. He moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked even his hardened rivals. He took every blow, every shot, but this time, he was fighting with a reason. He dispatched Verone, not with a quick kill, but with a cold, terrifying focus, fueled by the singular, crushing pain of nearly losing the only light in his world. He had burned his empire, his safety, and his indifference for one person. When the gunfire stopped, Antonio collapsed next to Lena. Not from a wound, but from the unbearable weight of emotional exhaustion. He held her, and in that moment, he realized what true agony was, the fear of loss. And what true strength was, allowing himself to feel it. Lena saw it too. The Iceman was gone. In his place was a man who, though physically numb, was emotionally raw and real. She treated his dozens of unattended wounds, knowing now that the real healing had already happened. He had burned the world to protect her, and in doing so, he gained a soul. He was broken by love, and that made him whole. Verone's blood was cleaned from the floor, but the stain of his discovery remained. The rival families whispered, "The Iceman melts." Every business deal, every contract, every strategic move was now scrutinized, waiting for the moment Antonio would sacrifice profit for protection. The other Capos didn't see love. They saw a critical leverage point. She taught him techniques to ground himself, the feel of ice, the sharpness of a taste, to cope with the tidal wave of feeling. She was his secret therapist, the only person who heard the screams his body couldn't make. Her greatest challenge wasn't stitching a bullet wound. It was helping him process simple guilt. The new Antonio was burdened by conscience. Unnecessary execution was delayed. A brutal order was softened. His old self would have acted instantly, logically. The new man saw the faces, the families. The men below him called it mercy. Antonio called it agony. He was dangerous, but now he was slow. And in his world, slowness means death. The relationship grew, but the reality of his life was a constant shadow. Lena became his anchor, but her presence complicated everything. The old guard, who valued cold logic above all else, saw her as an infection, slowly rotting the core of the family's strength. The old consigliere, Enzo, the family's traditional conscience, confronted Antonio. He didn't ask him to get rid of Lena. He presented a far more devastating test: to regain the full, undisputed respect of the commission, Antonio had to cut out a piece of his old life, something he loved that was not Lena. To prove his loyalty was still paramount, Enzo demanded he destroy a legitimate passion project he had spent 5 years building, a small shipping company that was his only taste of a normal life, and publicly silence a distant but beloved cousin who had compromised the family's books. Antonio made the choice. He chose the surgical strike, a betrayal calculated to inflict maximum political damage while minimizing emotional loss. He looked Enzo in the eye, and for the first time since meeting Lena, his face was completely blank. He gave the order to destroy his own company and exile his cousin. He proved he could still make the brutal choice, but the act cost him a night of silent, emotional torment. Lena didn't need to ask what he had done. She saw the emotional blood on his hands. She simply held him, accepting the truth that the man she loved was still a capo, but a capo who suffered the cost of his power. This was their unspoken contract. She would heal the heart, but she could not change the empire. Antonio Moretti taught the world that the truest pain isn't what breaks your bones, but what breaks your heart. And that vulnerability, when protected by conviction, is the greatest power of all. His story is a reminder that even the most feared figures in the darkest corners of the world are fundamentally human. And sometimes, it takes a healer to reveal the man beneath the monster. If you were captivated by the story of the Iceman, let me know by hitting that like button. And if you want more deep dives into the lives and secrets of the Mafia, including our next story on Mafia Hearts, then subscribe now and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.